Hello everybody, this is TipTop MTG here today with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking all of the sets currently in Standard. For those of you who don't know, Core Set 2021 was released a little while ago, and I really wanted to, first see how it impacted the meta and just, break it down before I did this video. But for those of you who don't know, that is going to be the last set in Standard before rotation happens. If you don't know what rotation is, basically, with the fall set every single year, the 4 oldest sets in Standard will rotate out. So a rule of thumb is take the older of the 2 core sets, that and everything that came out before it rotates out. So it'll be Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, War of the Spark, and Core Set 2020. Those will be all rotating out of Standard, which means you will not be able to play with them. If you're playing an MTG arena, what this will mean is that there'll be a renewal period where you get a bunch of extra rewards, and all of those cards are obviously going to stay legal in Historic. So those cards won't be completely useless, they just will lose a lot of their function. Now, because that is the very last set, Core Set 2020 is the very last set in Standard of 2020, I would like to take this time to break down all of the sets that were released and give you my thoughts on them, whether it is how fun they were, how broken they were on the metagame. It's kind of a combination of all of that. So, if you guys don't remember what the sets were, the very oldest set in Standard 2020 is Guilds of Ravnica. That was followed by Ravnica Allegiance, then War of the Spark, Core Set 2020, Throne of Eldraine, Theros Beyond Death, Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, and Core Set 2021. And then, obviously, when Zendikar Rising comes out, those first 4 that I said will be knocked off, and the oldest set in Standard will be Throne of Eldraine. So why don't we break down, in order, from my least favorite to my favorite, what sets I disliked and what sets I liked more. So, at number 8, my least favorite set in all of Standard is Theros Beyond Death. Now, I know a lot of people are going to not like this idea that, there are a lot of people who love Theros and love Devotion and love all these mechanics, but for me, Theros was probably one of the most boring sets in Standard. The whole set just seems boring. The limited experience was just meh. The impact on the meta, it really didn't create that many new decks. It was mostly just older decks that just got an upgrade. And just overall, every single aspect of it was meh. You could look at Core Set 2020 and be like, it was a very mess set, but, there were some redeeming aspects to it. And, Theros wasn't awful, but it also just wasn't that exciting. It just didn't do what I was expecting. I was expecting Theros to be this wonderful return, but, the Planeswalkers were not that good. They were kind of boring. I mean, Ashiok was kind of interesting, but just overall, the cards seemed boring, and, what can be a boring set can have a really good limited environment, and that can save it. But even Theros, it was probably my least favorite limited environment I've ever played in. And, that is, of course, my opinion. Of course, by the way, these are all my opinion. This is obviously not factual. I'm not saying, yes, this is the worst set. Let me know what your guys' rankings are in the comments down below. Moving on to number 7, we have Core Set 2020. So this was a powerful set in a way, but it also was boring, similar to Theros. I mean, the big, flashy Cavalier Mythics were all just meh, The limited was similar to Core Set 2021 in terms of it being very, just not super themed, but it just seemed even less themed. It seems like when I draft Core Set 2020, what I'm supposed to be drafting is not super clear, and some people might say that's a good thing, but I think that it's too vague. It's like, oh yes, I'm supposed to be drafting, elementals? I'm not a huge fan of and it's just overall, similar to Theros, it's just meh. But, moving on from this point in my ranking, there is not many sets that I dislike. Those 2 are kind of just meh, but moving on, Ravnica Allegiance. So I think it's somewhat basic, but it had very clear themes to build around, which, by the way, Guilds of Ravnica was when I first really got into Magic, really, started getting dedicated to it, and part of that was the release of MTG Arena, but I loved having the clear themes to build. It was exciting to build a Jumpstart deck and a Surveil deck, and while that may not have had a huge impact on the meta, it was very nice as a newer player, and it wasn't that bad. But, Ravnica Allegiance seemed slightly less interesting than Guilds of Ravnica, and it had all the strong points of Guilds of Ravnica, but it also was slightly weaker in the fact that the cards felt more meh. So those are my thoughts. And then obviously number 5, we have Guilds of Ravnica. So, Ravnica Allegiance was slightly worse in my opinion than Guilds of Ravnica. I think it was, similarly somewhat basic, had clear themes to build around, and, the limited environment was not bad in either of them, but this one felt a lot more interesting than Ravnica Allegiance. I think that at this point I'm calling all the sets above Guilds of Ravnica. So Guilds of Ravnica and above were pretty good sets just all around. Now I'm not saying, the sets I mentioned above are not, they were a decent power level. Some of them were too powerful, but they had other redeeming qualities. Speaking of too powerful but other redeeming qualities, we have Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths. It was a very powerful set, but it was most likely a little too powerful for standard. Companion was busted. Mutate was confusing, but Limited was some of the most fun I had in a very long time. Now, if you're playing on MTG Arena with bot drafts, for instance, everyone's playing cycling, but if you're playing that real Limited environment with real players, it is just really fun. It's a fun set in isolation, but when combined with the other standard sets, was just a little bit too powerful, impacted the meta a little bit too much, and honestly, going up to the set, I was most excited for Ikoria because it just seemed so different, especially after the, in my opinion, boring snooze fest that was Theros Beyond Death. So after after Ikoria Lair of Behemoths, we have Core Set 2021. This had lots of fun reprints for formats outside of Standard, whether it be Azusa or, Heroic Intervention, Grim Tutor, all of those were really fun. It had powerful new cards, but they weren't too powerful in my opinion. There may be a couple in there that are reaching a little too far, but they're not awful. And then we have simple but fun limited environment. It may not be this complicated mutating and cycling, it may just be generic creatures that fight, but it was really fun to play. Playing my Simic draw cards deck just felt really good. And it just was overall a fun set, even if it wasn't the most interesting. Now after this, I think we get, in your head, you probably know what two sets are left. So I'm just going to skip to number 1, and then we'll talk about number 2. So obviously the two sets who are fighting for the number 1 and 2 slot are Throne of Eldraine and War of the Spark. Both of these sets were actually highly controversial in terms of power level, and also just in other ways. For instance, War of the Spark, the uncommon Planeswalkers, and the Planeswalker passives were highly debated topics whether they were good or bad. And so at number 1, I have Throne of Eldraine. It was super powerful. It actually might be the most powerful set we have in Standard, but I enjoyed a bunch of the cards. It also had a lot of legendaries. Well, a lot of them weren't interesting, it did have those. It had a nice limited environment. It was one of the best we've seen in a while. Of course, that was messed up on MTG Arena, but then again, if you played actual limited, it was a blast. And adventures were actually very cool. It's probably one of the most interesting mechanics within all of Standard, besides something like Mutate, but that has its own problems. So I think that overall, Throne of Eldraine worked well. All of the mechanics were my favorite type of mechanic, except for one, Adamant. That one really didn't feel like a mechanic, but, adventures and food, which I'm going to call a mechanic here, it could be a deck. You could build a food deck, you could build an adventure deck, but you could also throw adventures in other decks. You could also have cards that generated food in other decks, and just everything about the set came together to work well for me. Of course, there was the Oko in the room. That was really powerful, and I do think that had they not have ever banned it, first of all, this probably would have been much lower on my list, but just, while power level of Standard is something I'm considering, I'm mostly a casual player, and so Throne of Eldraine just added interesting cards. Now, War of the Spark, that comes in at number 2, and I'm not saying that War of the Spark was a bad set. It was very powerful, and they had the little Planeswalkers, but it was really, what I think knocked it down was the limited environment. War of the Spark was one of my first pre-releases I went to that was really, really fun for me, and that may have been because, the one time my opponent played one of their bomb mythics, we had a Kasmina's Transmutation ready in hand to just get rid of it, and so, that is the one thing that knocked it down. I've seen a lot of people complain about the limited environment, saying that it's all just run by mythics. If you get a mythic, you win. And, unlike something like, Throne of Eldraine, the mythics are powerful, but they're not just going to shut down the game. But, a god that's going to keep coming back no matter how you remove it, unless you remove it in very specific ways, is just kind of broken in itself. So keep that in mind. That's the main reason that I broke it down. I like Proliferate, I like Amass, and I just overall liked the entire set. But just that limited environment did knock it down slightly. So, to break it down from number 1 to number 8, we have Throne of Eldraine, followed by War of the Spark, Core Set 2021, Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths, Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, Core Set 2020, and Theros Beyond Death. Overall, this was just supposed to be a fun video where I broke down all of the sets and kind of gave you my thoughts on them, kind of as a look back and kind of as a farewell to some of these older sets. If you guys enjoyed this video, please leave a like, tell me what you guys, what your rankings of these sets are in the comments down below, and I will see you guys in the next one.